Hey, this is Mr. Hargesheimer. We're at the end of week 6 of NTI, and I'm going to give you your week 7 assignment. It is what caused the Civil War, or the Mr. H and the way too long, slightly out of order timeline of events that led to the American Civil War, in which he argues that there is no other cause but the desire to perpetuate the institution of slavery, the evidence of which can be seen in political choices, resistance, and violence. So I'm going to show you all how to put together an argument. It's kind of a recap of all we've done this year. And I'm also going to give you a timeline of causes or of events that led to the Civil War. So the standards we'll be looking at are analyze the cause and effect of that led to the Civil War, evaluate specific problem concerning the development of the U.S., and the social studies discipline we're going to be looking at is economics. So we're looking at interdependence between North and South, how they depended on each other economically. And I would like you to watch the entire video, answer 3 questions. I'm going to give them at the beginning and at the end. And your answer must include a reason and show some knowledge of the event that you're going to be identifying. So, your 3 questions. What, in your opinion, is the most important example of a law or compromise supporting the slave system? And please include a reason why. What, in your opinion, is the most important example of resistance to the slave system? Also include a reason why. And what, in your opinion, is the most important example of violent opposition to resistance? So we're going to be looking at laws and compromises that helped expand and extend the slave system. We're going to look at ways in which people tried to resist that, and we're going to look at how they were met with violence. The laws and compromises are listed here, and I'll have the list at the end again. But we'll talk about the Fugitive Slave Clause from the Constitution, the Fugitive Slave Act of 1793, Missouri Compromise, Compromise of 1850, Kansas-Nebraska Act, and the Dred Scott decision. Ways in which people resisted, we will look at slave revolts. We'll look at a man named David Walker. We'll look at the National Negro Convention and the American Anti-Slavery Society, the newspaper The Liberator, the books Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass and Uncle Tom's Cabin. We will look again at the raid on Harper's Ferry, which you looked at for language arts, and the election of 1860 and some violent opposition. We'll look at some slave revolts and how people in power reacted to these. We'll look at an attack that occurred on the Senate floor. We'll look at Bleeding Kansas again, and then we'll finish with the attack on Fort Sumter. So, for the compelling question, what caused the American Civil War? I'm going to claim, so I'm going to go through an argument, and this is going to be my opinion, and I'm going to have reasons and evidence. I'm going to have a rebuttal, and I'm going to have I'm going to rebut a counterclaim, and I'm going to have some evidence to back up my rebuttal. So my claim is the American Civil War was caused solely, by the desire to perpetuate the institution of slavery. The reasons I'm going to go into is that the wealthy in the southern states benefited from the system economically, which is where I'm going to start, and in order to maintain it, and here's where my evidence is going to come in, they made conscious political choices, which will be those compromises. They reacted violently to changes to that system, or challenges to that system. So we'll look at challenges or resistance to it and violent reaction to it. And during my rebuttal, I will speak about how they eventually tried to leave the U.S. by the process of secession or seceding. So in this map, you can see that there are differences in the North and South. These are uses of farmland and industry. The little icons are going to be industries. You can see in the Northeast, they're kind of crowded up there. So the North is going to be more industrial. In the South and over in the Midwest, there's going to be more farming, but there are even differences in agriculture or farming in the North and South. So the slave system, which I'm going to claim is the cause and the only cause of the Civil War, is large-scale agriculture. And they use enslaved people, and these people are forced to produce marketable crops, including rice, tobacco, sugar, cotton. We have looked at in the past the encomienda system when the Spanish came over. We've looked at plantation systems in some of the English colonies outside of the United States, in the West Indies. Beginning of the year, we talked about Ireland a little bit. So this is a system, again, where there's large farming and people are enslaved and forced to do the work to make money for others. So in the South, they're primarily agricultural. There's a little bit of industry, but it's mostly agriculture. So by 1840, cotton was worth more than every other export that they had. They supplied 2/3 of the entire world supply. They were interdependent with the North, because when we talked about the North having textile mills, they got their cotton to produce textiles or clothing and blankets and things. They got that from the South. Because it was so successful, there was really no reason for plantation owners to try to develop industry or develop other businesses, especially if you're forcing people to do the labor at really no cost. So the people who are getting rich off of the slave system don't really have a reason to get rid of it. In the North, they're more traders, manufacturers, business people. By 1860, 90% of the manufacturing in the U.S. is coming from the North. 40% at that time were involved in farming, and this is going to include people in the Midwest. And in the South, we're looking at 84%. And a big difference is in the North, the farms were more mechanized. They used different machines, plows, and all those types of things to work the land. So as far as the amount that one person could do because of machinery in the North, one person could do a lot more, so it was less labor intensive. It was more labor intensive in the South when you needed a lot of people to pick the cotton, for example. So we'll start with one of my main pieces of evidence to back up my argument, some early political support for the slave system. The man whose picture's there is Henry Clay of Kentucky. In the Constitution of 1787, the one our current Constitution, Article 4, Section 2, Clause 3 says, no person held to service or labor in one state, and that means someone who's enslaved, under the laws thereof, escaping into another, shall in consequence of any law or regulation therein be discharged from such service or labor, but shall be delivered up on claim of the party to whom such service or labor may be due. Which means if someone were to escape the institution of slavery, they would have to be returned to the master. A few years later, Congress passed a Fugitive Slave Act that pretty much legally guaranteed the right of a slaveholder to recapture an enslaved person. So if a slaveholder went to some place where slavery was illegal, excuse me, then they would have to they would be able to recapture a slave and take them back. And also, the reason Henry Clay is on here because of the Missouri Compromise of 1820. Missouri was going to enter, and there was some dispute about whether it would be a free or a slave state. So his compromise was that Missouri would be a slave state, but to keep the number of slave and free states equal, Massachusetts would be split, and what is now Maine would become a state of its own, and it would be a free state, keeping the numbers equal. So, in our federal laws, there are these compromises and these ways to make sure that the slave system is perpetuated. So here are some challenges and violent reaction to those challenges. I'm going to talk about 3 different slave revolts that are notable for the violent reaction to them. In the first, there was what was known as Gabriel's Conspiracy. It occurred in Virginia in 1800. Gabriel was an enslaved man who had plans to raise an army, march to Richmond, Virginia, and capture the governor, James Monroe. He failed, and he was hanged with 3 others, but his story is going to inspire people to revolt in other areas. So he's going to inspire other slave revolts. And the violent reaction is, even though he escaped and had these plans, they completely failed, but he and 2 other people were hanged publicly. There was the German Coast Uprising. That was in Louisiana in 1811. Charles Dillon was aware of the Haitian Revolution, where Haiti gained their independence. He led a revolt that began with just 25 people. They murdered the master at the plantation where they were enslaved. They fought a battle all the way to New Orleans. On the way, they picked up other enslaved people. There was a long row of plantations, and they picked up people to support them on the way. About 100 of the survivors who were caught later and captured were beheaded, and they put their heads on stakes and lined up the road with them so that other enslaved people could see, here's what happens if you try to escape. So again, you have a challenge to the slave system and a really way over the top violent reaction to it. And lastly, Nat Turner's rebellion. Nat Turner was a preacher who learned to read. He and his men killed his master's family in his sleep. And over the next 2 days, they got together about 70 slaves, and they killed over 50 whites with clubs, knives, muskets. Turner and 55 others were captured and executed. Turner's body was mutilated. It was cut. His skin was stripped. It was cut into pieces. It was given out as souvenirs to people. It was really just a horrible, horrible event that occurred. So people, the whites in the area were now like fearful of slaves. If they had any suspicions whatsoever, they were killing slaves. So over 100 slaves were killed during that time. And this is when laws would start to get passed that would prohibit blacks from learning to read or write. It would be a penalty for them to know it, and would also be illegal for someone to teach them. So again, this is a way over the top violent reaction to help maintain the slave system. So here are some challenges to it. David Walker in 1829 published a book called An Appeal to the Colored Citizens for the World, of the World. It was a call for unity among blacks and to fight against slavery. He was also one of the organizers of the first National Negro Convention in Philadelphia in 1830. 40 freed African Americans gathered together. The man who's in the bottom, William Lloyd Garrison, he first published his newspaper, The Liberator, which was dedicated to freeing enslaved people immediately. It wasn't eventually it will come around. It wasn't, okay, some people here and there. It was everybody immediately would have equal rights. And in his first printing, the first edition, he had as part of an editorial um, the language that's in the quote there. I am in earnest. I will not equivocate. I will not excuse, and I will not retreat a single inch, and I will be heard. So he was very forceful in his hatred of slavery. And he also helped begin the American Anti-Slavery Society during that same time. Some more challenges in literature. You have the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass being printed in 1845, which talks about his education and his escape from enslavement. You have Uncle Tom's Cabin, which is an anti-slavery novel. So, narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass is a true story. Uncle Tom's Cabin is not a true story, but it was written by Harriet Beecher Stowe, and because of its descriptions of slavery, it really helped propel the abolition movement. And we've talked about already the raid on Harper's Ferry and language arts. So just quickly, John Brown attempted to capture an arsenal to start a slave revolt in Virginia. He failed at this and was hanged because of it. So some more political support, and this is a little bit later down the line. In 1850, there's a compromise, and there are 5 bills, and they're trying to avoid a confrontation over slavery. Uh, One of the bills is California becomes a state, but the main part that we want to look at is now there's a new Fugitive Slave Act, and this requires that not only can the people who've enslaved others come to free states to recapture, but the people who are in a free state, it is their responsibility now to turn these people back over to their enslavers. So it's a pretty profound change. Not that you have to let this happen, but now it's requiring that people in free states actively take part in helping maintain the slave system. The Kansas-Nebraska Act came up with John Brown. It allows for popular sovereignty, or the idea that voting, whoever has a majority of votes, can decide the question of slavery in the Kansas and Nebraska territories. And finally, on this one, there's a Dred Scott decision. In 1846, Dred Scott, who is the man in the painting at the bottom, sued for his freedom. The man who had enslaved him had passed, and because he was considered property, he was going to be turned over to the man's wife. But he had lived for a long period of time in a free state and in free territories, so he sued because he had lived so long in free territories that he should now be considered free. The man at the top, Roger Taney, who was the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, ruled that blacks were not citizens, and therefore, and this is a quote directly from Taney's decision, that blacks had no rights which the white man was bound to respect. So again, you have institutionalized at the Supreme Court support that's going to extend the slave system and perpetuate it. So there's some violent opposition to some of these challenges. There was an attack on the Senate floor. We mentioned with John Brown the sack of Lawrence, which was basically when people came into Lawrence, pro-slavery people came to Lawrence, Kansas, destroyed big parts of the city. So the senator from Massachusetts, Charles Sumner, spoke out angrily against this and mentioned by name Senator Andrew Butler, and spent a lot of his time really saying terrible things about Andrew Butler. So his cousin, Butler's cousin, Preston Brooks, on the Senate floor attacked Sumner with a cane and beat him unconscious, broke the cane, had to be pulled off and continued to beat him. Sumner survived, but he couldn't come back to work or leave his house or anything for months. He was so mentally beat down also by this attack. Also, Bleeding Kansas, we mentioned. It was a violent guerrilla war between pro-slavery and anti-slavery forces. We mentioned John Brown, and this is our language arts lesson. We mentioned John Brown's role in this at the Potawatomi massacre and the Osawatomie battle. Some more opposition. So you see Abraham Lincoln at the top there, and there's a battle at Fort Sumner. So, what is considered a challenge to the slave system, in 1860, Abraham Lincoln becomes elected president. He ran on a platform opposing the expansion of slavery. So he was against slavery, but he ran on a platform where it couldn't be expanded into new territories. And so the slave states, the southern states, after he got elected, they saw this as a challenge. So they seceded or left. So not only did they secede and were no longer considering themselves part of the United States, but in South Carolina, the first state to secede, the South Carolina militia claimed that the federal fort, because it was in South Carolina, was now their fort. So Abraham Lincoln announces plans to send supplies there. And so the militia in South Carolina bombs the fort and the federal soldiers that are in there. And that's what is considered the first battle of the Civil War. So we led all the way from institutionalizing slavery and supporting it legally to people opposing it and the violence that they're met with. So now we're at the beginning of the Civil War. So a rebuttal, or an argument that you will hear a lot of people make in relation to slavery or in relation to the causes of the Civil War, is that it was not really slavery, but that it's this idea of states' rights, that the federal government can't tell the southern states that what they can and can't do, and that there were cultural differences between the North and South, and that was the reason that they fought the Civil War, the economic differences that I mentioned earlier. So they'll look to these other reasons and say that they were causes of the Civil War. But I am going to say that these are wrong, because the rights that these states wished to protect, or the rights that they wanted to have, were the rights to treat people as property and to enslave them. So to say states' rights when you really mean the right to maintain and perpetuate the slave system is not an argument against this slavery. And I will go through my evidence, and then I'll put the questions back up. So each one of the states that seceded had a formal vote in their legislatures, and then they had to have documents that passed, and these were their declaration of causes of these states that left. Kentucky, on a side note, had a governor who was pro-slavery, but the legislature at the time was anti-slavery, so they never could formally decide to join the Union or to join the Confederacy or the South. So we were what was considered a neutral state, because we couldn't get an agreement between a pro-slavery governor and an anti-slavery legislature. So this is from Georgia's declaration. For the last 10 years, we've had numerous and serious causes of complaint against our non-slaveholding Confederate states with reference to the subject of African slavery. They have endeavored to weaken our security, to disturb our domestic peace and tranquility, and persistently refuse to comply with their express constitutional obligation to us in reference to that property. So they are coming right out and saying they're not getting the respect they deserve in reference to their enslavement of others. In Mississippi, a declaration of the immediate causes which induce and justify the secession of the state of Mississippi from the federal union. Our position is thoroughly identified with the institution of slavery. So again, coming right out and saying just like Georgia, we're leaving because our state is so deep into the slave system that it's who we are. And South Carolina, who was the first to secede, has written in their declaration, but an increasing hostility on the part of the non-slaveholding states to the institution of slavery has led to a disregard of their obligations, and the laws of the general government have ceased to affect the objects of the Constitution. So they're also mentioning that the institution of slavery and its perpetuation is their main goal and their purpose, and they feel as if it's being challenged, so they are leaving the Union. And just a couple of more. In Texas, we hold as undeniable truths that the governments of the various states and of the Confederacy itself was established exclusively by the white race for themselves and their posterity, that the African race had no agency in their establishment or took no part in it, that they were rightfully held and regarded as an inferior and dependent race, and in that condition only could their existence in this country be rendered beneficial or tolerable. So Texas, again, is not holding back with the white supremacy and the support of slavery. And the last one we'll look at is Virginia. The people of Virginia, in their ratification of the Constitution of the United States of America, having declared that the powers granted under the said Constitution were derived from the people of the United States, and the federal government, having perverted said powers, not only to the injury of the people of Virginia, but to the oppression of the southern slaveholding states. So what Virginia is saying, we ratified the Constitution, and the power should be for the people, and that the federal government is oppressing or keeping down the southern slaveholding states. If you can imagine the twisted logic that would go into that, you are oppressing us by threatening our institutionalized oppression of others. So, back to the three questions. Number one, what, in your opinion, is the most important example of a law or compromise supporting the slave system? And include a reason why. Make sure that it's clear that you understand the event. What, in your opinion, is the most important example of resistance to the slave system? Also include a reason. And what, in your opinion, is the most important example of violent opposition to resistance? Please include a reason why. And if you're the kind of person who wants to pause the video, I am putting up the color-coded examples. So if you want to look through these, take a moment, answer these three questions. You will include those in a Google Doc on Google Classroom and submit it through Google Classroom, please. And finally, have a great weekend. We're almost to the end of NTI. You have, with Memorial Day, after today, you will have 7 more of these days to get your work in. I need to have all of your work in by Tuesday the 26th by about noon, 1 o'clock that day, because I have to have all my record keeping turned in by then. So please stay strong, stay Highland proud.